Good morning, everyone. Last year in Santander, I gave this presentation, or rather the first part of this presentation. Last year, we focused more on the threat agents, and today we will be talking more about the behavior of that threat. So this is an introduction about myself, a brief introduction. And nowadays, everything is interconnected or connected, as our colleague from National Police Force mentioned. Nowadays, everything is connected to the internet, proprietary networks or non-proprietary networks. And as we can see here, we have also satellite communications, also lower communications carried out through drones, digital networks. Everything is interconnected through global information grid. Data are flowing all the time. Because they are flowing, can be intercepted, can be modified and changed. So regarding the perspective of the citizens, we have smart cities. Citizens, we have smart meters, electronic meters, then the public electricity, water meters. Everything is connected to the internet, so that service providers, utility providers can make better or be more efficient, manage the service better, etc. All that is interconnected, such as video cameras, surveillance cameras, traffic lights, everything which is connected in the net can be accessed through the legit proprietary, and can also be accessed through illegit or non-legit users. And as I said before, last year I focused more on the threat agents and the motivations, and this year we will be focusing more on vulnerabilities. Cyber threat, and this year I will focus on the top part of the pyramid. We have several types of agents. Criminals, as our police officer colleague mentioned, we are not that much worried about that. Criminals, we focus more on hacktivists or criminal hackers, organization, and also disgruntled employees. I've never met any of them, but they are also, all the time considered as possible threat agents. And then halfway through, when we are talking about the military industry, we should not forget about competitors. Competition between companies perhaps may create some offensive attacks to steal IP property, but our main adversaries would always be foreign nations as well as hacktivists groups, which are the main agents that will be attempted going against the rule of law. Criminals may more often than not be mercenaries working for foreign nations. Today we will be focusing on characterizations. Nowadays we have several models. Introduce is characterization of the different phases of an attack. The first step is having the attacker searching the infrastructure that wants to attack. Once the attacker is well aware of the content of the infrastructure and has detected the potential attacker, has to generate a weapon, therefore has to be weaponized for his attack. Once he has his exploit, he will deliver it. Often because companies and states spend lots of money on perimeter security, often what they do is they launch spear phishing campaigns, targeted attacks, so that potential victims fall into the trap, and therefore they bypass perimeter defense. Because email. Most of public entities and companies, well, they have email accounts enabled. So once you get an email and you open an attachment, this is enough for attackers to launch a multi-phase attack and to take control of very many devices and start to move laterally within the organization. Then we have the execution, and what it is most important in the cases is the command and control of that threat. Often the attackers want to be persistent in the victim, that is to say, to spend the largest possible time in the facilities, in the organization. Attackers want to steal information for long times to get a wealth of information, but sometimes they just are aimed at stealing some credentials, so therefore the objective is not persistent. They just steal the information and then they go away. And that, well, then they introduce malware so that forensic analysis cannot gather any digital evidence after the attack. So from the defensive viewpoint, so someone has developed the IKC, which is a model which allows to generate intelligence. In the past, we saw the different phases of an attack. So IKC is aimed at breaking the activities carried out by the attacker in every stage. The more we can attack the offensive actions of the adversary, the better our defensive mechanism. Well, in any organization, often people know that they are being attacked because someone has been infiltrated, then a flag is raised. So therefore, mitigation measures are implemented right away, and then evidence is gathered. Ideally, the recognition phase, that is to say, when the attacker has not infiltrated the organization yet, be wonderful to know the intention of the attacker, and that information can be gathered from the dark web, that is to say, to prevent further action on the part of the criminal. But more often than not, the organizations end up being reactive rather than proactive. But ideally, they should be proactive. Attackers, well, at the end of the day, are involved in business. Okay. As I said before, cyber criminals have as an objective to monitor the attack as much as possible. So a person who doesn't want to attack a government but citizens develops a ransomware, and this person wants to make 200 or 400 euros as a ransom for the information stolen, often through cryptocurrencies. So in this case, they want their attack to be highly effective. So if a criminal says, I want to steal credentials from individuals, so therefore I have to look for the operating system which is more widely disseminated so that I can maximize my profit. If the operating system which is more widespread is, for instance, Windows 7, this person will develop something to go against Windows 7. Then they distribute and launch a delivery campaign, for instance, through emails, and say, okay, emails which coincides with the, campaign for filing returns, and then they say, okay, I will be sending out 10,000 emails, and then 100 of them will have their attachment open. Therefore, I will be successful enough. But organizations who want to steal IP property, often the victims have invested in defense. So therefore, they have to sophisticate the attack more, and often they go to the black market to buy exploits. That is to say, because often potential victims have good security and protection in place. But in this case, the return on investment for this criminal is not monetization of the actual attack, but it is just control. So let us say that for state, well, the money is not that important, but it is very important for criminals. Criminals in charge of developing exploit may be working in both fields and to see where they could get the highest profit, and therefore decide whether they want to sell that to private individuals or to states. So if you do day zero effect, doesn't really make sense to sell it if you can get much more money if you sell it as an exploit in the black market. So now in terms of defensive perspective, so it's good. What is actually interesting here is to develop resilience metrics to see how much you can contain an attack. From the operational viewpoint, you have to have the overall view or to be aware of the whole picture about intrusion and the use of intelligence in these tools and infrastructure. So you have to frame these potential threats. Why do you need to have like overall picture of the threat? Imagine that there are being elections in a given country. Probably this is a good time for foreign agents to take action. So sometimes information out of context is not relevant. So later on we will see how the geopolitical context goes into all these play. So we gather information from attacks from the operation system or from the actual sample. For instance, if we detect that the threat has been sent through an email, we just analyze infected computers, and then we see what type of intrusion has that been. Well, command and control of attackers often last very short, and intrusions often survive for 24 or maximum 48 hours. That's when command and control expires. So if we get a sample of the evidence to be analyzed at 72 hours later, we will only have information about where the intrusion started. However, if someone has seized the computer, we could gather the full evidence and then to analyze the attack. Often intrusion, people do not fully deploy they don't deploy their full potential. One of the actions that may want to carry out is to pass unnoticed. If you have a day zero exploit in the first phase of the attack, you are kind of making or communicating that you have good resources to commit or carry out an attack, okay, say like $100,000 or $200,000. And we know that, for instance, young people, okay, do not have those financial capabilities. So, and therefore, as I say, it is clear that attacks such as Stuxnet that would never be carried out by a group of university students that require huge financial investment to carry out that type of investigation, to find the vulnerabilities, developing a relevant exploit, and then to deploy it, to launch it. So probably you will need classic intelligence, and then to go to isolated network through a US, and then, well, you will have probably to bribe a person, and those type of attacks can only be committed by attacks or by companies in charge of managing huge industrial installation. This is not like what we see in the movie, having an individual at home behind a computer and then sending out an exploit. No, that is not the way it goes. And now, from the operational viewpoint, as I said before, is to find the gravity centers that prioritize the use of resources. And now we often use APT for organized group. In banking, they use FIN. Well, at the end of the day, we are talking about the same thing. So people who are paid are given financial resources to cause significant financial harm, going against the company, state, you name it. From the viewpoint of campaign analysis, we have all, well, we look into the techniques used by attacker. That is to say, we find out how they operate and where. So this is the diamond model for intrusion. So we have four boxes: adversary and victims on top and at the bottom, and then an infrastructure and capability. But we add meta characteristics or meta features to it. And we also add a social, political context and a technology context. Linking all this, it is very important to be aware of key dates or milestone dates that may be relevant for organized crime group because of any reason, religious reason, political reason, and at those specific dates we have to raise our alerts because they are very likely to take actions. So especially through denial of service campaigns, which are more often than not used by hacktivists. This could also be represented in this graph, clear graph. So we have several campaigns. So if at a given point in time, if we analyze how these operations are being carried out, we can see that we have repeated patterns. So when you have patterns received, we could infer that this has been carried out by the same people or by the same group of people or people who are related to each other. So if we see a connection between different campaigns, probably there is a link between the agents behind those campaigns. From the financial perspective, it's very easy to have a financial organized crime group doing that, and from the viewpoint of also of crimes against the state, probably we have the same organized group behind that if we find this repeated pattern. Then in terms of processing activity groups, this allows us to define the analytical problem others. Mitre model. On the left, as we can see, it is aimed as proactive detection, and on the right we see incident response, forensics, and mitigation. Mission assurance is about having the system working from a reactive viewpoint, whereas the proactive part is about preventing entry. Mitre has developed this table characterization or classification table. It is available for free in the website. So if you have a threat and you want to characterize it, you fill information out in that matrix. So as you are carrying out your analysis, you are filling these boxes. And here, this is a good example of it. It's a broken down example of carbon black. We see the ports. Well, I can read it from here, but probably you cannot read it from where you are sitting. So imagine that the port 443 is being exploited. Then you enter this data in this matrix. What is the advantage of it? Once you have characterized the threat that you are receiving, then you have defined the threat, and you can submit it to your managers, to your boss. Often bosses do not have technical understanding of what is happening. However, this matrix allows us to present the threat, so it makes it easier to understand what is happening. So You don't really need to explain what is being used for the attack, but it is very easy to display and to show. And you, as an analyst, also can find this of help. Reporting could be very lengthy and tedious, and this table gives you a pattern, good guideline to follow for reporting. And actually, this method is more and more popular as it's been found to be very helpful to present threats. And this is not only about escalating it or useful to escalate it within your organization, but also to share it with other organizations. If we all use the same language or the same system to classify threats. For instance, if we send out this matrix to Belgium or to any other countries and they also use this very same matrix, they will use it right away. And now we have FireEye model. So Mitre is a flat model, and this one has a loop in it. This model insists or focuses on persistence. So there is no one only model which is valid. I like FireEye model because it displays or focuses on lateral movement and persistence. When we want to characterize the threat, there are sources we can use for it. First phase is about collecting information from open sources. That requires to carry out some work that can be automated through tools, for instance, tools to search websites and others. However, other type of actions require hard work, because, for instance, going to darknet. In the darknet, you can't really use a crawler that using natural language processing gets all the information that you need. No, it is not as easy as that. So sometimes when people are interacting in a forum, they may be interacting with people from FBI, CIA, or NSA who are working on it and are collecting useful information for that first phase. And the information is gathered through scanning and through campaign. If you log into forums such as Anonymous, you can really see how interaction that is taking place between them. So these will give you a feel as to whether they are going to launch a denial of service attack against the Department of Defense, okay? And you can raise or trigger early alarm. Then here we have darknets, and then often attackers use it to hide themselves, and then from there they carry out lateral attacks. They pivot from that, from the defensive viewpoint. That's where we work. What we do is we just place probes in those subpoints to see whether there are some processes which are being run in the memory, whether there are any indicators of compromise. So this allows us to have telemetry for us to see, to check the status of our network. Then scanning and indexing. Some people do not really like to do internal auditing, including pen testing. I feel that pen testing is very important, very useful to strengthen your own defenses, whether it is white box, black box, gray box. Often people are reluctant to scanning and indexing, and especially in industrial environment. If you go and tell someone at the nuclear plant facility that you want to carry out pen testing, probably they would not agree with it. If we were to do pen testing, it would help us find vulnerabilities and block them. But often managers are afraid of pen testing getting out of control and causing any type of harm. So that's why it is difficult to get that information about vulnerabilities. Now, malware processing. This is, other things that we do other than forensic analysis. And this is where you can get the most information from. I'm not saying this because that's what I do, but because it is the way it is. So if you succeed at finding a sample which is being run in your network, you get lots of information. So anything you will subscribe on, you will get like threat bulletins. Well, to me, what is happening to a bank may be none of my business because it is not my business. But I really need to know what is happening in other NATO countries, because what is happening in other NATO countries will probably reach me very soon. So if in another NATO country they analyze the threat and they report it to me, I will be using it, or vice versa. So therefore, we will not have to duplicate any work. Well, do not believe that there are 500 malware analysts like you see on TV. There are only few group of dedicated people. It is very costly to train dedicated people specialized in malware processing. So resources devoted to malware allows us to train as I say, people experts in malware, and then, well, information is shared. And then social engineering, coming to events such as this one, could be a very good way to recruit talent. If you come over here, you may, through networking, you may meet people, you may meet people who may sell exploits you, or who will be helping you out. So we should not forget about human interaction as a good source of information. So famous image of the iceberg. Dark web, in the case of government, this is the main source of information about what is happening, but we should not forget that surface web also delivers significant amount of information. So for instance, we have lots of open source code or GitHub that could be used for malicious activities. Well, someone may just post that information with no bad intention whatsoever, but it is clear that if you find an exploit in a website such as GitHub where there is no control about what comes in and out, then you get the source code and you may analyze it, and you may set up a Frankenstein malware, which are all the malware samples that have been kind of cutting and paste from here and there. And if you compile it and you are successful at it, you may distribute it, and you may be successful. So these things are easier to make if you in these portals. Okay, but if you want to go to exploit, you will have to go to dark web. That's where all these things are hidden. And then, well, you may buy exploit kit at $35 or $40 that allows you to create a malware or campaign and to distribute it easily. So, well, this is very important for corporations to be aware of. So you can configure a number of options like just debugging and all that. If you're lucky enough, you can even bypass defensive measures of non-classified networks of corporations. So that does not require significant effort and could also help you to hide some campaigns in some cases.
As I was saying, we don't have enough talented people in the big corporations devoted to malware analysis. And very often we may hire cybersecurity companies. Usually SMEs do not have specific staff devoted to this, and it's only the big corporations that have people in-house for that. And even in those cases, they use companies just Deloitte, S2, and others that provide services at a very high price. And they monitor your networks. They have forensic services, malware analysis services, and so many companies are cheaper than having people in-house. And as I've said before, they don't have the problem of looking for talent. The talent is concentrated in a bunch of companies and the others just hire them. Dímelo.
Como os decía, el análisis de malware resulta de vital importancia.
Malware analysis is very important if you want to be a step ahead of the threat. At work, we receive a lot of bugs, and many are generic. Any ransomware you may receive at home. Same campaigns over the email. We don't care about them. But there are samples which are more targeted, and we had to analyze them. It may take you between 2 days or a week, and you can see what's there. In your bug, static and dynamic behavior, you send a report, and the right measures are applied, especially disinfection, what computers have been infected. And then a few days ago, a report is published on open sources with a sample which is similar to yours, perhaps a different hash, but it's similar, and it's clear that it was designed by the same group that attacked you. It's really easy for an attacker to modify small details so that it's not exactly the same thing. In this way, they avoid antivirus, because antivirus are usually quite weak. If you use an antivirus, it analyzes the hash, and if they know it, it's okay, and if they don't know it, that was it. There are more parameters that can be analyzed besides the full hash of a file to establish whether it's a good or bad file. The next slide we'll see if they belong to the same family. It's like the Dalton brothers, they're all evil. In this case, we can see there are reports which are very similar to yours, and you had it a few days in advance. Companies that sell cyber intelligence, all this type of information, when it's published, they limit what they're offering. Because I've talked to them in events, and they say there's some details that they omit, because they're interested in selling a premium product to third parties, or for whichever reason they don't want to inform the attacker about how they could obtain that type of information. We have deeper reports compared to what they've published, and I was surprised to see that they didn't reach the conclusion that we reached, because once you've reached point C, D and E were easy. We must say that very often your bosses do not allow you to devote all the time of the world to your samples, and you have to stop at some point. But in case, I think it's because they decided not to share it. If you're not familiar with malware analysis, there's something called compromise, indicators of compromise, which is the characterization of a sample. If there's a command server, the IP it connects to, if it uses a series of function of Windows API, hashes, this type of things are characteristics that may make up an IOC. With your tools, you can verify whether the IOCs you've developed, whether there are more computers in your network that are infected. That's why it's worth making an IOC. If I know there's a bug that it's creating a persistence key in my register, I'll do something so that it analyzes the key to see that if the new computer has this clear indicator that the computer has been compromised. If we include a lot of and or at some point, we'll have lower probability of false positives, so we'll have an IOC which will be effective for our organization. This IOC have more value if you share them with other people, because of course you save them the time for the technical part, and they can directly search the networks for these samples or a similar one. If you're not good in creating IOC, we're going to have false positives, false negative, which is worse. Disadvantages, as I've explained with the diamond, lack of context. That's not good. You need to know why that sample, that IOC of a sample, is valid for you. If I receive one from banking, that's not useful for me, there's no context. You say, this is an IOC. If you're not attacking something I'm interested in, I don't have it. Running an IOC on a computer, just one, takes about 15-20 minutes. What happened?
Puedo seguir dando la charla sin pantalla, ¿vale?
Well, I'll continue without the talk, so it's even more boring. Do I wait? The idea of IOC is sharing. I'll go to the last part of my presentation. There are presentations such as MISP, which is free. People can create collaboration portals. People can share IOCs and threat descriptions so that if you create a community for sharing information with this type of platforms, you have an early warning system in which every member of the community can carry out previous action based on what's happening to other people. In the specific case of May's platform, developed by an institution in Luxembourg, when you share, you can choose what you share in that descriptor you created. So if you have a descriptor and there's some details you don't want to share with everybody, those details will not be included in the shared material. You'll keep it for yourself, but perhaps you don't want to explain the number of devices being infected. What's bad about not sharing, where little kids do not share and adults do not share either? They don't share everything they should because they don't want to say that their network had been infected. It's like saying, I've been tricked, and people are not sharing everything they should. Perhaps this is more a theoretical level. Perhaps this is done at 60%, 70%, but I'm not sharing everything I should. Sometimes people do not share everything they should, and in real life it's even worse. The idea of integrating sources, as I've said before, utilizes to have the best intel about this threat. If you just have things from open sources, etc., you'll be in trouble. But you say, okay, I have purchasing power enough to pay a company to sell me feeds, which is information about threats, ongoing threats. There are companies, I cannot say the names because I'm not paid for advertising. They're the biggest in the market. They have 20,000, 30,000 clients around the world, and they have probes on this client. So instead of having a sharing platform for free just for malware events, for example, they have corporate banks clients and they sell you that part. You buy that part, banking, for example, and from Singapore to California, you see everything that's happening in every bank. If any of them receives an impact, you're notified. What a context. Sometimes campaigns are focused on Southeast Asia, for example. It's true that most organizations have seats around the world, but it's true that sometimes attacks are focused on South Korea. Everybody thinks that the attacker could be North Korea. Well, North Korea, if they have no interests in Europe, they're not going to distribute the campaign in order to mitigate the possibility of detection. The more people you're hitting, well, you'll be pointed out. Fingers will be pointed at you. For a big bank, they have shares or assets everywhere around the world, knowing that its branches are being attacked in one part of the world, help the bank to take action. For example, if it's being hit in Asia, it can take actions in Latin America due to the different times. They can take mitigation actions. For example, in the case of stock markets, they depend on the time zone, so they can gain time. This is not forensic analysis. Once it's over, that's forensic analysis. It doesn't make sense. You may have a lot of money, but you may have a lot of cars. You buy a garage, such as Cristiano Ronaldo, so you have 12 cars on your garage. But Cristiano Ronaldo can only drive one car at a time. So, 12 cars, he can only take one. If we buy 5, 6, 7 providers, half our providers, well, I'm not going to say they sell smoke, but almost. They all have the same probes installed, and they're selling the same product to the end client. So if you just have 1 or 2 providers, there's no overlapping with the information, because if you have too many providers, you may have infoxication, you may have too much information, you cannot process it, you don't have enough people, and at some point you see that they're overlapping. They're selling the same IOC several times. The normal thing in organizations is having 1 or 2 source providers, and you combine that with yours, with internal information. Internal information gives more value to the organization, but external information, in the case of banking, they shouldn't be ignored, because they could be put into a context with your business environment. Now we're going to move to a more technical part. When you start to receive a lot of malware samples and you need to analyze them, what you want is serializing who could be behind this. And this is going to be included in a campaign, and that campaign is going to be organized by someone. Once you analyze a bug, and you don't know what it is, you don't know where it comes from, but when you see the MO, what's doing, if it's through the email or not, you can have an idea of what's going on. So you want to try to serialize this type of actions to have a context for your threat. If we manage to find the connections between the samples, this is like the films. You find a signature that says something. What you're going to find is a pattern, some patterns, because they use some programming techniques or attack techniques that make you think that it's the same group or the same person. If you find that, in the end, you'll say, this comes from the same person or group of people. But what they're doing is every 24, 48 hours, they generate a new sample with a little difference. So that perimeter defenses cannot detect it, because they usually look for the signature and very little of behavior. Usually behavior is not that easy to detect. Once you've characterized the sample and everything it does, you say, okay, it can belong to the same group of people. They've reused code that was available at the dark web, and other colleagues working there analyzing networks have detected it. That information, you're saying it's specific, but actually you can buy the modules and you cannot attribute it. Everything that's available in the black market cannot be easily attributed, because you just have to pay for it, and depending on the cost, that will allow you who could buy it. There are new methods that allow us to do representation of big data. We have thousands of samples in our personal collection, and you can create cool drawings such as this one. What does this mean? This is from a real campaign, APT1. We have 3 samples to analyze, and the dominions jump. Every 48 hours they change. We see they use common Dominion controllers, and we can conclude, without real possibility of being wrong, that the 3 samples have been developed by the same group of people. Instead of doing this with 3 samples, we do this with 30,000. We don't do this manually. This I do it manually, but not this thing. We do it with an IT application that allows you to generate graphs. If you apply this to your sample group, and it allows you to say that this comes from the same group of people with 2 different campaigns. The square graph is one campaign and the circle is another one, but they are the same agents. The interconnection between these nodes is the basis of this. And for you to know how the graph was generated based on Dominion controllers they have in common, we could generate these graphs. The upper ones connected to ones, and the ones at the bottom to others. You have a code, a complete code, the initial sample, for example, and you see there are functions. You analyze it with IDA, and you see parts of it which sound familiar. You analyze it, and you see how you say, well, this was bought, this is new. If you don't want to be detected, one of the techniques is using Windows bugs that a Windows API use. If I use something which is personal, if I get caught, if the police comes to my place and found the code in my computer, I'm going to get caught. But if I use the Windows, I'm not going to get caught. It's stealth. So based on code fragments which are different, you can find ways to find similarities. For example, the order functions are called. There are different tricks to configure the percentage of code that is similar. Attackers want to maximize the win. If they are using small victims, they're going to change 4 lines of their code so that in maximum 1 hour or 20 minutes, they have a sample which is completely different and they start a new distribution campaign. If you need to reprogram everything, you know how long it takes to do one of these things. It doesn't make sense because your man hour is going to be more expensive than the profit you're going to make with your campaign. So there are samples with a high percentage of similarity and others with a smaller percentage. As I've said before, there are models, and the most frequent is the one based in anagrams. We'll finish the presentation with this. And this allows us to see coincidences between, or matches between samples. We've analyzed a sample, we characterize it with all these little points that would be the IOCs we've configured. And B sample has these dots. We draw a Venn diagram and there's a coincidence. The 2 samples have elements in common. If we do mathematical calculations that we consider reliable, we create a function that allows us to analyze these. We can establish the similarity degree between these 2 functions. There are functions that allow you to make these comparisons, and you obtain the similarity percentage. The similarity is represented as a percentage, 0 to 10 to 100. This is useful to explain things to your boss, and with the Jacquard index, that's the one I've used for my presentation, this complies with the three characteristics. You need a normalized value, you need to understand how it works so that you can explain it and you can empirically verify that it works. You need to validate your method. This is a paper, you present it, and it's your own method. Jacquard index is very good. This is another graph. Which is an example of use of Jacquard index. If there's no similarity, this would be the upper left square. Nothing to do, no ISA in common. They haven't been made by the same person or a different campaign, or they changed the MO. And the second, there's a full match between IOC. If you haven't established hash as IOC, it would be the same sample. There are other ways besides the hash to establish IOC. So here the IOC is reliable, it shows that it was made by the same person. And then bottom left, just one common IOC. It was not probably done by the same person. There's very little in common. And if they're using the same technique, they'll probably use the same function, but that doesn't prove that it's the same person. They're just using the same method. And then up bottom right, you have 4 matches out of 10, so 40%. So maybe not. Usually, according to Jacquard index, you use it when there's 80% of match. You can represent it in a table. This is similar to what we explained with regard to meter, how to represent the threat. This is huge. Separate campaigns from the same agent, samples received in APT1, and this shows the different campaigns in a very easy way. So I've already gone through the last part when we couldn't see the presentation. I'm just going to show the slides about mix. It allows you to identify the threat, the agent, the indicators, the campaigns. If you follow this graph, you can define who's doing what. You can analyze the campaign, states and taxi as protocols in order to define and exchange information. And this is the last panel they've developed. So you can see how complex this is. You may think this is simple, but filling all this in takes a while. Sometimes it takes longer than the campaign itself. But you have a history of campaigns, the campaign history. So you see what we saw a couple of slides before. You can analyze the similarities between them. It's not the only option we have. Cortex has a lot of weight now to characterize threats. It uses color code, graphic panel, and this was my presentation. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. I hope you liked my presentation.
Yes.
Good morning. The state has abilities to prevent and mitigate this type of attacks, and with all that, why don't you do it like white hats? A vector of noise for attacks are domestic routers. And there are failures, known failures that could be mitigated by the state, like some white hats. They've created a patch, regardless of the will of the router user. Instead of waiting for someone to use this router to attack and make noise through the network and making people's work more difficult, why doesn't the state take a role as white hat and execute things itself? Lack of budget. I think it's a perfect answer. At the end of the day, human resources and economic resources are limited. In CIBE, that organizes this event, I guess that in very short time they'll have the responsibility of doing that. In Spain, it wouldn't be the army, it would be in CIBE, the one in charge of citizens' security. Second question, is it possible? The attacker and the attacked are two sides of the same coin. Spain sells weapons to Arabia to attack Yemen, so somehow they're looking for that to turn against itself. How the state or the army considers this type of issue, where you have an attacker and attacked. Could you please repeat the question? Spain is currently selling weapons to Arabia to attack Yemen. Spain and could re-attack Spain. We said they're terrorists. How is the army working with this twofold mentality? I'm not allowed to answer to that question. Other question which is technical.
Sí, por favor. Está aquí en primera fila. Está.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. When the last markets were closed in darknet, in the dark web, what other types of communication are using the criminals?
Vale, me preguntan por las.
She's asking about the trends among cyber criminals in the dark web. They change the methods. Usually threats evolve, and you need to follow the evolution of the threat. So information is not static, it's dynamic. They change their parameters. So if they have a trend and they see that you're stopping them, they change their tactics. So it's always easier attacking than defending. If attacking, you have the initiative and you have to react. It doesn't matter how much information you can gather in advance. They say, well, Windows is fashionable, we attack Windows. Android, we attack Android. They've implemented a patch for this, well, let's go for something else. They're always a step ahead, and they work with information about unknown vulnerabilities, someone that creates exploits. You have to pay attention to that. They're not static. A static attack today would not make sense because they're patched very quickly, so they evolve, and the cleverest ones don't publish things in the dark web. The lack of talent that even states have make them leave tracks in the dark web. You can pick up these little things and have an idea about what's coming, but when you realize, and we've seen with the graph, they're already inside, and you have to analyze. As our work as forensics, we have to see what's happened. Any other question? Well, thank you very much.